It's preparing to live stream. 1 second, please. Perfect. So we are on YouTube. Oh, why do I hear that? Hello and welcome to the Business History Conference book series. My name is Paula de la Cruz Fernandez and I am the BHC's digital editor. Today, October 18th, 2024, is the third of our live streaming book interviews. For more, check out the BHC's book series calendar on the website, thebhc.org. This interview is being live streamed on YouTube, and I am monitoring it in case any questions come that way. The video will be available on our YouTube channel after the interview is over. Today, I have the pleasure to host Dr. Ben Waterhouse, who will talk to us about his book, One Day I'll Work for Myself, The Dream and Delusion That Conquered America, published with Norton. Ben is a historian of modern America whose scholarly research focuses on the culture and politics of business in the United States. And he's also the author of Lobbying America, The Politics of Business from Nixon to NAFTA, and The Land of Enterprise, A Business History of the United States. I encourage you to check out his website, benjaminwaterhouse.com. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Paula. Thanks for having me.
Today, this interview is hosted by three other outstanding scholars. Katherine Turk is a professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an expert in the histories of women, gender, and sexuality, where they intersect with work, the law, and social movements in modern America. She has a forthcoming co-author publication with University of Virginia historian Sarah Milov, titled Karen, Silkwood, A Life and Afterlives. Hello, Katherine.
Hello, Paula, and everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor Richard John is also with us today. He's a historian who specializes in the history of business, technology, communications, and American political development. He teaches and advises graduate students in Columbia's PhD program in communications and is member of the core faculty of the Columbia History Department, where he teaches courses on the history of capitalism and the history of communications. His publications include many essays, 8 edited books, and 2 monographs, Spreading the News, The American Postal System from Franklin to Morse, published in 1995, and The Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications, published in 2010. Hello, Richard. Thank you for being here.
Hello, delighted to be here.
And Dan Wadhwani is the Director of Research and Graduate Programs at USC Marshall's Griff Center for Entrepreneurial Studies and is the Jill Brooks Garnett Chair in Entrepreneurship. His research has focused historical approaches to studying the relationship between, studying the relationship between entrepreneurship and socio-economic change. He is former president of the Business History Conference and former chair of the Management History Division of the Academy of Management. Hello, Dan.
Great to be here, Paula.
I will start by asking Ben to tell us a little bit more about him. You can go impersonal as much as you want, or just keep it professional. And tell us a little bit more about how this book that we're talking about today came about.
Sure. Well, great. Thanks for having me, and it's really a pleasure to be here at a business history conference event like this. I've been a member of the Business History Conference since I was in graduate school, I think my first conference was in 2007. I didn't make it to the next year, but I don't think I've missed one since 2009. Technically, I didn't go to Mexico City a couple of years ago, but I did participate in that conference, as many of us did by remote, by Zoom, or whatever the platform was. I don't remember. And so this is, a group and a community that's really near and dear to my heart. This is my second monograph, my third published book as a historian, and one that I think draws on a lot of the experiences that I've had over the years with the history of business, or with the community of business historians. So yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, a little personal, a little professional. The book largely came out of a longstanding interest that I've had in what I describe as the politics and culture of business in the period that I, have studied mostly, which is the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century now. I've always been interested in why people in general, politicians, the American popular culture thinks what it does about pivotal questions of business, economics, work, and the policies that inform those things. And so that was sort of the driving force, even when I didn't recognize it, behind my first book, which was about big business corporations and big business lobbying organizations in the 1970s and 80s and their effects on things that we often call the right turn in American politics, or the embrace of neoliberalism. When I was moving past that book and looking for another project, I kind of gravitated toward a question about smaller size companies. In one sense, I think maybe my original thought was, I wrote this book about big businesses and big business lobbying associations. Maybe I can look at the other side of the ledger and consider smaller ones. And what I discovered I was going to say quickly, but it wasn't really quick. It took me a number of years to realize that, small business as an analytical category doesn't work the same way big business does as an analytical category. And what I wanted to investigate, I couldn't do in the same way. So rather than sort of center small business as the focal point of this project, I eventually moved to centering the idea of working for oneself, which encapsulates a huge range of things: self-employment, freelancing, contracting, franchise ownership, multi-level marketing, investing, and so forth. And so I found that this was a way to kind of take a seemingly simple idea, I'll work for myself one day, and expose what I think is an important story in the history of the last 50 years, primarily in the United States, where the book is set. But I think there are sort of ramifications of this in other contexts, other political economies around the world. And that's where I came up with the book. It ultimately ended up being an economic and, I think, cultural history of the last 50 years of American life from the 1970s, with a particular concentration, I think, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then into the early part of the 21st century, that situates a cultural norm, a cultural idea of working for oneself within a changing economic landscape, the economic changes that we know of as the sort of end of the post-World War II growth economy, and the rising, well, on an economic level, rising inequality and rising sort of atomization of business and work opportunities, the stagnation of the middle and working classes, and other features, from financialization to the rise of the service sector to deindustrialization and globalization. So I try to put all that in, and tell it through the story of people who made the decision to work for themselves, as well as the kind of structural forces that encouraged them along the way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Richard, do you want to start?
Sure. Ben, it's a wonderful book, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I know a large audience will enjoy reading it as well, in part because there are lots of stories about individual small business people, sometimes called entrepreneurs, and in part because of the way you frame it. And so my question is, your backstory begins early 20th century New Deal, and then the story really picks up in the 1970s. But the frame is not so much the self-made man of the 19th century, but these cultural whispers that we have today so naturalized. They're all around us. And I wonder if you could say something about the New Deal as a backdrop for our understanding of our current moment. And I'm thinking here of the institutional arrangements that come out of the New Deal with regard to labor.
So I think there's a lot to the New Deal as a framing device, as you put it, when it comes to things like labor. I do think, though, it's important to recognize that the New Deal doesn't create the modern corporation as the sort of gold standard of the economy. That is something that comes out of the late 19th century and really blossoms in the years before the New Deal. What we get from the Great Depression forward, though, is a political economy that is that tilts the balance more in favor of workers and working class people than had been the case before and was the case after. You might call it an exception, a grand exception, a long exception to the kind of trends of capitalist development, going way back. But the institutional arrangements that you reference in the New Deal provide or help sort of solidify an environment where workers do better, opportunities rise and spread for a growing number of people, and there are limits on the sort of the upper reaches of corporate wealth and success, basically the constraint inequality. My argument is that creates a set of cultural expectations that are really borne out in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s among Americans in general, but what the economy can in fact provide for them. When those trends start to reverse for political reasons, for ideological reasons, for reasons of global competitiveness, and the promises of the New Deal period are no longer kind of being met, American society responds in various ways. But the way that I'm most interested in is this turn toward individuals and the turn toward going it alone, doing it yourself. The prevailing sense, which I use the analogy of the cultural whisper, the sort of voice that's out in the ether that it's hard to you recognize it when you see it. That what happens is that I argue people become increasingly kind of attentive to these voices that tell them, you can't expect large institutions to do this for you. You can't expect labor unions to be the path by which you get better wages or working conditions. You can't expect government regulations to work in your favor. What you really should do is go off and do it by yourself. And so there is a very, I think, pronounced political argument in this that it's the failure of those institutions in the post 1970s period that helps propel the renewed faith that some scholars would refer to as entrepreneurialism, the notion that this is a norm, this is a thing that one should aspire to, rather than one out of many sort of economic options.
Thank you.
Katherine or Dan? Dan?
Yeah, I would love to build on Richard's question. And you mentioned kind of entrepreneurialism as kind of, an ideology, a kind of set of norms of you moving in this direction. Like Richard, I really enjoyed the book. And one of the reasons that it really mattered for me, from my perspective, is it kind of, in some ways, counterbalanced the scholarship that has emerged on tech entrepreneurship and the association of entrepreneurship, that kind of the history that goes through Silicon Valley, the kind of Margaret O'Mara kind of code, kind of narrative of the development of these ideas, in the sense that, so much of that focuses on the embrace of technology as kind of this key mediating libertarian idea for its reaction against, in some ways, ideals of big business and the New Deal. What you do, and for me, this was really kind of powerful, was that you're showing really that this is, there's a similar echo among small business folks, right? There is and maybe it's sort of a separate stream, a separate sort of set of developments about kind of what it means to start, because most of these small business folks are not really kind of engaging in tech per se, or in that, right? And yet thinking about kind of this norm of entrepreneurialism, this sort of cultural whisper. I'm thinking about kind of the work of people like Bob Everhart who've talked about it from the tech perspective, or my colleagues at Copenhagen Business School who are talking about it from this kind of VC and narrative, that the narrative's controlled by tech and VC in that case, right? But you show that this is a broader, I think, set of ideas that is much more bottom up, even among small business folks, which I think is forgotten there. And yet there is this real tension, right, between, the entrepreneurs of maybe Omar's book, maybe an Elon Musk, sort of one of the wealthiest folks in the world, and the entrepreneurs of your book, who are, everyday folks, small business folks, and yet somehow this language reconciles that. Can you kind of grapple with how that works, right? There is an interesting tension there, and maybe of this cultural norm to incorporate such a range of kind of business activity that it's almost baffling, and creates this interesting tension that your book raises.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I think that's exactly right, and I think that maybe step one is recognizing that this is the dynamic that exists. There's a massive disconnect between what the world of business ownership, entrepreneurship, and self-employment looks like in reality for the vast, vast majority of people, and the way it kind of appears in the culture, in the zeitgeist, in the media, and the way we talk about these things. And I do think it's important to both point that out and to really interrogate that, and not just for me. I think that's a project for historians and other scholars in general, in large part because of the very practical effects of misinformation on that point. If people think that entrepreneurship means starting a computer internet tech company, or inventing the next new thing, and therefore they're going to go into that, they're going to be gravely disappointed with the results 99.9999% of the time, because that's not how that world works. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody who's actually in business ownership. It might be a surprise to a bunch of 19-year-olds in entrepreneurship classes in college, but shouldn't be. And that's something that Bob Everhart, among others, is really pushing as well, to be honest and to be upfront with our readers, with the constituency of people who are looking to scholars to make sense of the world, about what is and isn't actually happening. Now, the push and pull between kind of the lauding of certain kind of cultural figures and the lived reality, I think is fascinating and puzzling. And I think it's as I said, a project for lots of scholars to dig into. But Dan, you're right. If you look even at very sympathetic and kind of pro-entrepreneurship research about what do people do when they're creating new companies, the number of new companies that are going into something that could be called the tech space or computer technology in one way or another is like 5%. Most people are going into business services, into retail and wholesale, and even into construction. That's where independent work is more often than not happening. But that's not the story you get if you walk through the bookstore in the airport, right? Because it's all the Walter Isaacson people, right? It's all the Jobses and the Musks, which is, as I said, it's misleading. It's also indicative of a culture that is sort of singularly focused on exceptions, on success, and so forth. We don't talk about people whose businesses fail. We don't talk about the people whose businesses kind of barely just sort of tread water. Your local restaurant or tax preparer. They might be a perfectly fulfilling thing for somebody to do, but they're not going to become wealthy. They're not going to beat the system. They may just sort of go on with it, and that is itself, I think, an important part of our modern culture and our modern economy. But it is a far cry from this sort of hero worship of an exceptional few. So in many ways, this is sort of like maybe a kind of call to democratize the study of entrepreneurship, not unlike what the historical profession has done in any number of other fields, right? Where we consider military history from the bottom up, or we consider political history from the bottom up.
Can I just sort of a quick follow up on that? And from kind of a historical point of view too. I mean, it seems like a particularly interesting area for political history to kind of consider because, in some ways, so much of the narrative of the last 30, 40 years is about kind of the division, the fractionalization of the language of politics. But in an odd way, entrepreneurship has become a language of consensus in some ways. There's,
Right.
and so it's sort of funny. And your book, I think, really brings this out as why there's this tension here is you do have this sort of way in which a lot of kind of the tensions here get channeled into the language, the cultural whispers of working for oneself. And I think that's fascinating from the point of view of, trying to grapple with some, political history that way too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and as I said at the beginning, that's kind of where I came at this from, a quest to understand why the prevailing assumptions of our political discourse seem to take shape the way they do and the way they have in the last number of years, and why efforts to present different political strategies or ideas tend to fail, frankly. And you're right, and this is I'm certainly not the first person to observe that entrepreneurship as an ism, as an ideology, is generally bipartisan and widely loved, and there's no politician who could ever go wrong by talking about how great small businesses and entrepreneurs are. I really enjoyed one particular part of the book where I got to kind of recount the story of Joe the plumber and Barack Obama on the campaign trail in 2008, which is something that was kind of like burning in my head for years, since it happened, really, and point out, plenty of people pointed out at the time that the person who presented himself as Joe the plumber, the small business owner who was going to be taxed into oblivion by Obama's proposal, was not a plumber, and he wasn't a business owner, and his name wasn't Joe. But to try to set that in some recent historical context to understand that this is the powerful pushback against political arguments around taxes, around minimum wages, around government regulations, and so forth. And so I do think that grappling with the power of this discourse is really critical for scholars to do.
Well, maybe I'll jump in here. Earlier, Ben, in your response to Dan, you were talking about the range of people that you'll meet in this book, that readers will encounter, some of whom may be vaguely familiar, like Joe the plumber, who I appreciated revisiting that moment in time through your pages. But others are folks that most, if not all of your readers, will never have heard of. And that, to me, is one of the strengths of the book, the depth of the research, the variety of archetypes, but also individuals, many unexpected and surprising, who come together and are so beautifully woven into your story. And many of those individuals are women, a population who might not feature quite as centrally in business history as perhaps they should. So I wanted to ask you about how gender shaped the book. Women entrepreneurs, male breadwinners, tropes, but also individuals who maybe hewed to or defied the tropes of their era. And I also wanted to ask whether it was surprising to you that gender proved as relevant to this story as it did, and that women proved as central to the story as they do.
Yeah, well, thanks for that and for bringing this up. I'm struggling with how to answer because I don't know how much of the answer to your question is a reflection on me as a historian and things that I have learned and become better at along the way, and how much of it is a reflection of reality and perhaps my slightly better ability to assess it. There's a lot of statistics that you could start from, and that was one thing that I did, kind of observe as I was broadly reading in the trajectory and histories that had been written before about self-employment. There's a very noticeable and often remarked upon increase in the presence of women among the ranks of the people who own their own businesses that tracks my timeline exactly. There's, we often use the sort of 1960s and 70s as a moment of in which women become more represented in the workforce and working for pay outside the home. I observed about a 10-year lag, and then this very similar phenomenon happens when it comes to business ownership. And there were people writing about this from a more social science perspective in the 1980s and 90s. And so in some ways, the reality on the ground is what drew me to this side of the story. Perhaps maybe hanging out with colleagues like you over the years has also had a positive influence on my ability to incorporate gender as a framework of analysis, and I'd like to think so, because once that door is open, it becomes an unavoidable and just glaringly obvious important part of this story, that at the same time as work is becoming, in many people's eyes, more individualized and more something that becomes one's own responsibility, where traditional sort of worker protections or pensions and things like that seem to be less and less common, is the same moment in time when service work starts to replace manufacturing work in the aggregate in the economy. And care work becomes a more significant part of it, all of which are things that are coded feminine and female in our culture. And it sort of seems to tell a much more coherent story that even as sort of women at the sort of top end of the economic system, and I do describe some of the very, very powerful, well-to-do corporate feminist types who are doing that. As they're trying to break glass ceilings, there's another whole kind of realm of this story where women, out of necessity, are also entering into the entrepreneurial world or into the world of business ownership or self-employment, in a changing economic world, in a world of what Elizabeth Warren calls the two income trap of the 1970s and 80s, as more middle class families have two working parents and so forth. All of these were things that I started to observe, and then as I started following breadcrumbs to different archival sources, it became even a more prominent part of the story. And one of the most important archival sources that I used came from someone whose papers are at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, which is a women's history library primarily. And this was a woman named Joanne Henderson Pratt, who had a career in supporting, advising, and kind of boosting home-based businesses, both for companies that wanted some part of their their workforce to kind of work from home part of the time, decades before COVID, to actually encouraging people to kind of take the plunge and work for themselves out of their homes. And when you bring home into it, suddenly the gender dynamics become even more inescapable, because the whole push for working from home, especially in the 1980s, which is sort of what I argue is the first wave of this, was geared in many, many ways toward making an appeal to women, particularly women with young children, to work from home and kind of solve the problems of the have it all dilemma, or the problems of support and childcare and education and double day and all of those things via this miraculous notion of not going to an office or a work site, but rather going to the home. So that was maybe that's one of the middle chapters of the book, and one of the places where I was most trying to kind of examine the gendered nature of these ideals and what they had to say for the kinds of things that people might expect, or the kinds of ideals or goals that people might set for themselves.
If I could, yeah, thank you. If I could jump in to pick up on this, there were changes in, let's call them work regimes or assumptions. Some of these changes were shaped by court rulings concerning who is a franchisee, right? Concerns about healthcare. At the end of the book and at the beginning of the book, you talk about the need for a new social contract. Yet, unlike so many books that make such a call, labor unions are not at the center, in part because it was very hard for a lot of your self-employed to work in labor unions. So if we could kind of pull back ask the question, not only where do we go from here, or how did we get here, but what are the key institutions that are transforming workplace? And as I read your book, they have an awful lot to do with law, an awful lot to do with public policy concerning healthcare, concerning who is an employee, who is a franchisee. And for me, that was one of the great strengths of the book, was it might surprise readers to know the extent to which our work lives are bounded by these conventions.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right that there's an institutional and political story at the heart of this transformation. I'm not sure I have a sort of one simple trick to solve all of our dilemmas, but you're right, first of all, Richard, that labor unions themselves play a particularly muted role in
Right.
this story, except via their absence. Right.
Right.
It's precisely the lack of the kinds of protections that labor unions can offer that compel many people that to try start out on their own or work for themselves. I think part of the answer to your question depends on what one is trying to actually accomplish. I have conversations like this often where this sort of embedded assumption is, what do we need to do to strengthen the small business sector of the economy, or what do we need to do? What do we need to do to encourage entrepreneurship or entrepreneurs? And there are plenty of people who address those questions. I'm not particularly sure I'm one of them, and I don't really have any answers. I'm also not really sure that those things need bolstering necessarily. I think my personal kind of politics on this are that what needs support are the people themselves who are doing the work at various levels. Certainly, the decoupling of health insurance from employment would probably solve address both of those issues, right? If you did in fact want to encourage more people to work for themselves or start a company, then you would have much more portable and health insurance that's not linked to your job. To the extent that your health insurance is linked to your job, then that's kind of where we end up. Ironically, and this is a point I do make in the book, the big push against substantive reforms to the healthcare system in the 1990s, the Clinton effort, was in large part spearheaded by the very kinds of companies that would actually benefit from not having to pay for their employees' health insurance. And even in the 2000s or 2010, when the Obama administration finally did get the Affordable Care Act passed, it didn't get a huge amount of support from the business community in general. I mean, there were a handful of places where the business community kind of stepped back, but there was also a lot of fighting, and the campaign against the ACA ever since has really been tied into to business interests. I think seeing the connections between these macro trends and the decline of labor union membership and the kind of individualized notions of healthcare helps us understand why this trend maybe seems to have, if not accelerated, then persisted and become kind of dominant in our thinking. And as I said, you sort of implied also that I did not end the book with a gigantic call to action. I did, in fact, have that conversation with my editor, because it's fairly common when you write, especially for a trade book like this that comes up to the present, that you sort of end with, and here's what you should do now. And I had to actually directly tell my editor that I didn't want to do that. I like being a historian, and I like kind of making arguments about how things have changed in the past and how we got to where we are. And I hope that someone else might pick up the ball and run with it.
Mm-hmm. This is a book not only about dream, but about delusion. And to pick up on just earlier comments from Dan, that this is a book that is meant to disabuse your audience of certain assumptions that they may have had or may continue to hold about what work is like or what their role could be in the workplace. And so I can't forbid, this is just a quick addendum, there is a personal dimension to this book. You talk about your own father and your own
Yep.
family situation and your own kind of awakening to the delusion. And I'm thinking here also of the very fine scholarship of Lee Winsel, who I was delighted to see was an influence on this book. His innovation delusion addresses some of the issues that have been discussed. So is this a wake-up call? Not only do we need a new social contract, but we need a sort of a catharsis. We need a come to Jesus moment about what the world is we've created and how we're likely to advance our collective interests in the future. In other words, not a policy prescription,
Right.
a sermon.
Well, I do think that one of the functions of history and business history, in particular, is to inform readers about, an argument for why the world that they live in is the way it is. And one of the challenges of doing more recent history is that, people who are still alive don't like to hear that so much.
Yes.
No one likes to be, no one likes to be historicized in their own time. But yeah, I mean, there is a critique in here, and I have apologized publicly to Lee for ripping off the word delusion from the title of his book, and he said it was okay. But he and I do, frankly, see eye to eye on the larger project of trying to dispel hype. And as I put it toward the beginning of the book, this isn't a knock on owning your own business. If anything, it's a knock on the kind of unthinking hype around it that comes from people who aren't, in fact, owning their own businesses, but who are benefiting somehow from other people's dreams. And whether that's by kind of sidelining the policy issue and saying, okay, well, sure, maybe wages are flat or childcare is expensive or, racism or sexism or xenophobia is preventing people from succeeding. But the solution simply is go do it on your own. I think that's not, I don't think that's the society I want to live in. And I think that there's a story and a history for how that came to be. You mentioned my father, and I did throw my cards on the table a little bit with that. And I got a chuckle out of one of the reviews, early reviews for the book, which kind of did call out my daddy issues, apparently. And I have no idea if my father would have been better off sticking with the job that he hated, throughout the 70s and 80s, and he quit his job in 1989, and for the last kind of part of his working life worked on his own. I don't know if he would have been better off in a job he didn't like. I know that he probably would have made a little bit more money, but he also made kind of calculated sacrifices, spent more time with his kids, and more time enjoying the things that he enjoyed in his life. I think a lot of people who own their own businesses make those kinds of calculations. My hope is that they're, reasonable and informed calculations, not delusional, moonshots, to try to like be that one in a million app developer, influencer, person who, has a great idea and sells it for $10 million. Because while there are a small number of people who do that, most don't. And I think a society that is kind of rooted in that type of risk-taking, gambling, is also one that's really rife with exploitation. So I do think that the part of the role of the historian is to explain, how these things got here. And yeah, to be a cautionary tale, sure. I talked to a lot of people who own their own companies, both while I was working on this book and since. And most of them seem to echo a lot of what I say. Maybe at first glance, they take umbrage with the word delusion. But I think when you get down to it, they say, yeah, this is one of the things that people say all the time is this is not for everybody. This is hard. This is time consuming. This is, you sacrifice hobbies, friends, family, money, and so forth. So it's got to mean something to you. It's got to be really valuable. And for folks like that, eyes wide open, I'm totally on board. But it is, to the extent that this ideology becomes something that enables exploitation, I wanted to, try to, if not be a cautionary tale, open eyes to the history that led us to that.
Well, I really appreciated in your answer, Ben, when you talked about what historians can and cannot do, or maybe should and should not do. And And I really also appreciate how many audiences I think this book will reach, both popular, but also there's like serious research in this book, both primary and secondary, and serious points and interpretations that other scholars will benefit from. And I'm also impressed by just the range of methodologies, historical methodologies that you use, from cultural history to social history, intellectual history, the history of technology, and more. And I wonder if you see any of those methodologies as sort of the most salient or the most primary, with the others in service to it, bearing the most heft, that's like, no, this book is really, the most important methodology I used was X, and the other methodologies I just was sort of bringing to bear. Or are you a sort of ecumenical historian who loves all your approaches the same?
Oh yeah, so I have to choose among my children now, right? So, I mean, I think the most honest answer that I would give, and in any context, but particularly speaking to scholars and fellow historians, is that I tend to be more materialist in my view of the past than anything else. When I look at the human past and my period, or any other period in history, I tend to look at economic structures and macroeconomic forces and ask how something far less kind of maybe visible, such as the realm of ideas and culture, responds to those types of changes. This can obviously, like anything, be done to a fault. I mean, it can be overdone, and you can become very reductionist. And I try not to. But I do frankly start from these large questions. And, I've learned a lot from many people who have written in economic history and the history of political economy, history of capitalism, to sort of see those types of forces as the driving forces in history, but not explanations in and of themselves. So, from the time I was in graduate school, I was hearing things like, oh, well, in the 1970s, the bottom fell out of the post-war economy and the Keynesian consensus collapsed, and bada bing, bada bang, Reagan. And I've never liked that. I've always thought that there were steps in between. So while I'm very persuaded that the nature of the post-war economy was fundamental to how America existed in those years, and that the difference between that period and the post-1970 period is, very, very important. I start with that, but then I try to figure out how those connections actually work, how they're made. So this is, it's not a purely intellectual project where sort of floating brains come up with ideas and those percolate through society. It's not purely, maybe a social history bottom up thing where, some group of people gets very animated around an idea, coalesce, create groups, and enact change that way. But it is, as you put it, multiple things happening at once, and that makes it a messy story. I do think, I'm not quite an unreconstructed Marxian, but I do, start from these sort of economic frameworks, and then try to dig deep and see actually how do these ideas, practices, beliefs, and so forth, make their way to different levels of society. Why do they catch on? Why do people believe what they believe? As messy and weird as that is to try to actually lay out.
If I was thinking about this question, and I was thinking back to your first book on lobbies, and one of the recurrent themes in this book is the importance of popular writers, whether it be Peter Drucker, I think Sarah Edwards, or associations for independent business people. And I was thinking of the work of Jennifer Delton. I think that she did that very fine study in the National Association of Manufacturers. That's a kind of business history that deals with large groups, because the NAM membership largely small businesses, but that's a way to give coherence to your story. And I thought you did a fine job of that. Peter Drucker, for example, making entrepreneurship accessible for everyone, when there were only 2 courses in entrepreneurship at any U.S. business school in 1950. That's a way of post-holing, it seems to me, to put an otherwise unwieldy topic into a sort of comprehensible frame.
Yeah, well, and I should note that I have a lot to owe to Dan on some of that as well, on the trajectory of economic or business education and entrepreneurial education.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's a good point, and there's a lot of there's a lot of overlap between the first book and on Lobbying America and this book, maybe more than I was aware of. Every once in a while, as I was writing it, I would say, "Oh, I'm finally finishing that argument that I never quite made when I was writing my dissertation or my first book." Um, but
Mhm.
I think that's right. Major centers of power, whether they're economic power, intellectual power, or political power, uh, do have an outsized influence on debate and on the way issues are framed. So I think finding the sources of that are important. And nonetheless, that's not the whole story either. And I think the challenge of historians in this type of work is to try to measure the unmeasurable, right? How much does what
Right.
the National Association of Manufacturers says about tariffs or environmental regulations actually move the needle?
Right.
Now you can't. I mean, it's an unknowable thing on a certain level, but we can qualitatively assess these ideas, usually by getting down to the nitty gritty. And when I say, when I point to somebody like Drucker, or Alvin Toffler, is another
Mhm.
person who pops up in this book, it's because I see them somewhere in the historical record. I don't start from the premise that, well, Drucker's a famous, you know, management guru, and therefore I should go and read what he wrote and write about it. I see it cited in, a speech that somebody gives to a Rotary Club, or in a brochure that somebody sends out trying to attract people to their group. Which is why I think, archival research is actually really important to what we do, even when we're talking about the kinds of historical actors that have a presence in, national newspapers, or
Mhm.
the larger levels of society. When you get down to it, that's when, that's how I found Toffler. And then, of course, there's plenty you can read about him because he wrote and people wrote about him, and you can read what Daniel Bell had to say, and so on and so forth. And Richard, I did end up invoking the future schlock
Yes.
epithet that was levied at Toffler. So, as I said, I think the way to do that is to start in some sort of archival or other primary source base, and figure out what people were actually saying and who they were reading, and go from there.
Yeah, I'm
Dinesh. Oh, sorry. Dinesh is one of my favorite case studies. We don't have his last name, and you got
Right.
that out of I guess some kind of social scientific
Yeah, it was anthropologists, and they didn't use the last name.
anthropologist. Yeah. So.
Yeah, just sort of building on Katherine and Richard's points about kind of some of the methodological aspects here. It is sort of interesting that, this is a cultural history, right? It's a cultural history in the end, but one told in a very different way than many cultural histories, right? In the sense that it is grounded. It's striking to go from the introduction that talks about whispers to the first kind of substantive chapter where you're deep in the National Federation of Independent Business and
Right.
in the NAWBO, right? It's in many kinds of cultural arguments, you would expect okay, here are the texts that matter, here's sort of the ideas that matter, and yet even the way the book reads, it very kind of immediately moves to the organizational level and the archival level, and then kind of works up. I'm struck by it because I think it's got some interesting points there about how that might actually be kind of an interesting way of bridging some of these arguments. I think that among other things, we're able to, this is a book of labor history as well, a book of regional kind of corrective from, is this is entrepreneurship a history of the American West, as some of this, the scholarship puts it, or is it really a national history? So I think a lot of that comes out of, moving beyond the kind of the discourse level to get down into the organizational level and look at sort of the discourse as politically motivated, organized, etc., and yet still take the kind of mythos seriously, right? To say that that's not just sort of you know, epiphenomenal or whatever, but but really kind of something that we need to kind of take seriously and, go. I think you say delusion, but you really take that myth seriously. This matters to people. I mean, it's a myth that has to do with independence. It has a myth that has to do with freedom and control. Those are, if we're going to believe in myths, those seem not a bad set of myths to believe in, right?
Sure.
So it's an interesting kind of methodological kind of approach to um, kind of dealing with those things within something that's a business history as well. So just wanted to ask about kind of that process of interpretation.
Yeah. I mean, I think my dissertation advisors would be happy to hear you say that. I guess you can take the boy out of political economy, but you can't take the political economy out of the boy. That's I'm not sure it was as deliberate a strategy as it is just how I see things and how I see history and business. That I do think, as I said, these institutions matter, and they are they're visible. They're there in the past to be interpreted and understood, and yet we can build on them by not just sort of assuming that they said something and therefore that was what happened, or that their interests were particularly clear or undisputed. And so I've always been fascinated with the way organized groups of people within the economy, whether it's labor unions or business associations or anything else, talk about what they do and think about what their objectives are, and then setting those debates and conversations in the context that they lived in and that they operated in. And I have found that that's a useful way to do it. As I said, I wasn't trained as a cultural historian. I was trained as a political historian and a historian of capitalism and business. And so I think maybe that's why I'm drawn to the institutions more. But I also, I'll stand by that. I think that's a way to get at these important phenomena.
Well, can I just add to that though? Because it feels like, Richard asked the question about, well, so the embedding of this in law and kind of more formal institutions, but really the organizations and institutions you're looking at are social movement institutions, right? They
Right.
may be, and there may be a way to say, okay, but those are the places to get at the bridge between some aspects of culture and some aspects of the more formal sort of things that a lot of tradition, kind of traditional ways of thinking of institutions and organizations may miss.
Right.
And so I think that it makes it an interesting model for trying to bridge those things. So
yeah, one of the very early times that I presented anything related to what ultimately went into this book was at the BHC in Miami in 2015, and I was presenting on this business institution or business organization called the National Federation of Independent Business. And basically, in my 15 minutes, what I argued was that it was a social activist organization that treated itself as a business, that organized itself as a company. And so I said, oh, this is actually sitting at the intersection of maybe more traditional business history and more traditional political or social movement history, because even though this was not a for-profit venture, it was political action. It was a political committee, basically. It was a business interest association, is what the social scientists would call it. But I said, well, we actually look at this like almost like it was a firm, and that got very interesting. And we could also look at it as though it were a social movement that has those kinds of objectives. And so I do think bridging those silos can be really fruitful and useful.
I read your book, I think, more darkly than Dan does. I see the delusion as more central than the dream. And I'm thinking of putting it up against, say, the recent scholarship by Gabriel Winant on what happened in Pittsburgh to the union workers there, and also putting it up against, and you knew I'd get around to this, the recent work, often very sympathetic to small business, of the New Brandeisians.
Right.
And I read this as more critical than sympathetic to the new Brandeisians, and more sympathetic rather than critical to Gabriel Winant, which is more or less, I read that as a kind of a not a Jeremiad, but it's almost a eulogy for a world we have lost. And I wondered if you could position yourself in that literature, since after all, entrepreneurship, small business. Lena Khan has just courageously got through these rulings on non-competes, and now there are rulings on being able to join and leave, subscriptions and clubs. Those are all seen as initiatives that promote small-scale entrepreneurship. So I wonder if you could speak about yourself within the Scylla and the Charybdis of contemporary political economic writing.
Which one are you and which one am I here?
I don't know, but I'm lashed to a pole.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this actually really does get down to the politics of the scholars much more on the face. And I'm not particularly well equipped to assess my own politics for reasons that also, maybe maybe a psychologizing of the book would have to get into. But I think the positions that you've laid out, Richard, really do get down to these fundamental questions about one's belief in the ability of humans to have large institutions that are nonetheless democratically structured. And I think what's central to the Neo-Brandeisians is that they don't believe that can happen. And that they're deeply skeptical of large institutions at all. Now, that's not, to say it's not new is of course obvious. They are neo to a jurist who has been dead for 100 years, or close. In that sort of turn of the 20th century critique of corporate size that we associate with Louis Brandeis. This passes through another phase in the 1960s and 70s with the sort of Ralph Nader wing of progressivism that similarly was skeptical of all concentrations of economic power, and was really quite instrumental in deregulation along exactly those lines. And I think that there's another wing of the left that Winan is, I think, an embodiment of, that is a little bit more comfortable with bigness. And I think, that debate, I think, has been going on since at least 1912, and it doesn't really show much signs of abating. I don't think of myself as stridently leftist as others writing in sort of some labor history journals, but I think I am, as you point out, more on that side, at least in terms of my my ability to conceive of large scale and yet democratically accountable institutions. It's a fascinating and I think really important debate, but I think it's important to kind of have it on those terms. If you think that that big institutions and that have control over people can actually be democratically run and structured, then you're opining, the world that we've lost, or that sort of New Deal order, mid 20th century political economy. If you think that even saying that is hopelessly naive, I'm not sure how to even resolve that argument, right? Because if you start from the premise that people always and everywhere will be corrupt and incapable of holding any power without exploiting their fellow person, and the conversation kind of stops. And I think that's where the debate has sort of settled. As I said, I do see myself slightly more on the side of being sympathetic to at least the possibility of more democratically organized large institutions, and that there are some historical models. They're not perfect. There's quite a bit to condemn about the way organized labor operated in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, or the way the Democratic Party did, or the way the regulatory state did. There's all kinds of things to criticize. But if I'm an unreconstructed Galbraithian, then that's probably where I end up.
Just a quick coda. I was at a conference on the New Deal recently with Nelson Lichtenstein, and he gets up at the end and what is it we should care about? and he just spoke, I think, for 10 minutes about the Wagner Act, which is not in your index. It's not missing entirely, but that is not what was important for working people about the New Deal for you. And I think that's an interesting counterpoint that puts you in a position somewhat, put one ant at one end and say, you know, Matt Stoller at another. You're a somewhere middle position on the New Deal, which is where I do see this book start. I mean, it is, yes, 1970s on is your wheelhouse, but the post-Second World War organization man, big business, is a backdrop for what happened in the 70s, as I read.
And I mean, it's interesting that if I were to kind of think of myself in terms of what a historian of what class, this is a book about the middle class.
Yeah.
You know, people trying to get into it, people falling out of it, people, you know, exceeding it. It's not, you know, it is about work and it's about workers. But I don't think it's about the working class in a, you know, very straightforward way, the way other works of labor history might be.
It reminded me a little bit of Olivier Zunz's book on the middle class, some of the aspirations, and hopes for autonomy in a world in which that's hard to realize. And there are so few business books about the middle class. I mean, that goes without, that's the past famous cliche about the field. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're arriving to the end of the interview, and for my experience, I read the book and I felt very I felt represented. Also, I'm a business owner at the moment, so back to, you know, the chapter on women for sure, and I think there is also like follow up with the pandemic. That's at least my context. And also the immigrant story. That is, you know, and I think that's why the book is an American history, but the immigrant story could also be a very important part of it. But I don't want to make any more questions, or because it's the time we scheduled. I really appreciate everyone's participation, and Ben, congratulations on your book and publication.
Thank you, Paula.
This is the BHC book series, and it is a program to promote the work by BHC members and business historians. And thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you
all very much.
Thank you.